Before we get started with the show, here's a quick word from our sponsor, Global Training Center. As trade compliance professionals, you want to make sure that your procedures and documentation are completed as correctly as possible to avoid any delays and possible fines. We provide a range of trade compliance courses that will fit your needs. From in-person or web training to recorded on-demand courses, we can train one or even thousands on your team through your learning platform or on our portal. We can even customize a private session for your team. Go to globaltrainingcenter.com to find out more.
Folks, we're ready for another show of the Simply Trade podcast, and I'm going to tell you we got a great show today. It's one of those that this is going to be one where we haven't hit a whole lot on the maritime industry, and it's going to be an aspect of this where we're going to get to talk about those ocean liners or the cargo ships and all that kind of stuff that's going on. But before we get started, I want to say hello, Lalo, and how are things going down in Texas for you?
Pretty good, thank you, and hi, Andy. And as you said, I'm also pretty excited about this because we talked to our guest, the primary contact for this show, and she was very ambitious about us going through and coming up with a few episodes on this because it rightfully so. There's so much that we can talk about cybersecurity for maritime industry, et cetera, and the initiatives going on with the U.S. government. And of course, they'll talk a little bit more about that. But so be prepared to see multiple episodes of this topic that we're going to be bringing on and that are worth saving to your playlist or even on YouTube. Just saving them, saving those videos so that you can go back and watch and even show your management, because what we're going to talk about are things that, not even I would have, I'm like, oh, that's right. I guess we should be considering that, or we should be thinking about that, just things that happen. And coincidentally, just yesterday, I think yesterday or in the last couple of days, the Biden administration, or President Biden, I guess, in this case, he signed an executive order specifically almost mirroring this, what we're going to talk today, the cybersecurity on our ports. And again, our guest will talk a little bit more about that. So just wanting to say all that, that's what we're covering for today.
Well, let me introduce our guest here. This lady is somebody that I had the privilege of meeting, several years back now that I think about it. Amy Strauss, who was at the time with CBP and our Customs and Border Protection, by the way, and had the privilege of sitting with her in some meetings on a private government working group, where we literally re-engineered and redesigned the entry process that made a significant improvement in entry processing and whatnot. And it's being used today, and it was a great time. But Amy's one of those who was such a pleasure to be around, and smart, but she was young, very young back then. And I was watching her, and I got to tell you, Amy, I am very proud of you for what it's worth. You don't, I don't owe you anything. You don't owe me anything out of this, but you have done well for yourself. You're now with the FMC, or the Federal Maritime Commission, I understand. Why don't you talk a little bit about what you're doing nowadays?
Andy, I remember those meetings so well. It was just a lot of fun, and I appreciated the energy you brought. But this is the thing. Y'all think Andy Strauss is a nice guy. Wait till you're like stuck in a room trying to work through an entry process with this guy. Like he's a pit bull. Don't let it fool you. So anyway, I'm so pleased that y'all are having us on. It's such a timely topic. So in this capacity, I'm representing DHS's Analytic Exchange Program. Before I lose all the viewers and acronyms, just know it's a public-private partnership, right? It's funded by DHS, and they're funding areas that are of importance to the mission. And what's important to the mission is cybersecurity. You heard that loud and clear when Biden came out yesterday with his executive order with 20 billion? That's a B. That's billion with a B, folks. That's a ton of money. The risk is there, and the importance is being really captured by this administration on how do we get these how do we address some of these cybersecurity risks? So I've been working in this field for a couple of years, and as my tour of DHS was almost done, I came into contact with Nick Reese. Nick was up at DHS. He had worked as the director of emerging technology at DHS, which sounds as exciting as it is, right? And of course, talent walks, right? So he split off from DHS. He's now the co-founder and CEO at Frontier Foundry. And if you watch them on LinkedIn, you can just see, here's Nick talking to this group of people. He's not, he's a thought leader. My Aquarius cohort here, really the one that helps put in simple language what these threats are like. And I know that that's really important, right? Because as an industry, as a trade industry, we're used to cargo, we're used to freight, but it's like cybersecurity, it's almost like hidden a wall. You're like, what are you talking about here? Like, so Nick really puts it into simple terms that I think breaks it down for folks. And that's why we're excited to talk with you here today.
Nick, we really appreciate you also joining us, Nick Reese. And again, why don't you tell us the name of your company and your role that you're playing there?
Absolutely. So first of all, thanks so much for the opportunity to be here. It's a pleasure to meet you. It's a pleasure to meet the whole team. And it is always a pleasure to be able to work with Amy. We work together at DHS, as she mentioned. And even though we both kind of split off, we've tried to find ways to continue to work together. And I'm so happy that I can be a part of this. So, so I departed DHS just last year and co-founded a company, an artificial intelligence company called Frontier Foundry. And we're working with a couple of different customers. We're using our artificial intelligence to detect risk, to do optimizations and things like that. And basically take things that AI is good at, letting the AI do that. But then let humans do the things that they're good at and really kind of just optimize human experts to let you be an expert at the thing that you're an expert in. And that's really what we're trying to do. We have a couple of different things that we're looking at, especially in the kind of national security, homeland security space. But I'm the COO there, and I'm really enjoying the time we're growing, and I'm just really excited to be able to continue to work on the mission like this.
Fantastic. Well, I appreciate that. And it's like, as Amy said, you seem to have a good knack of being able to break things down, the complex into more simplistic terms. So with me, you're going to have to almost draw pictures because I'm dumb as a box of rocks here. So as we get into this, cybersecurity, and we're talking more about the maritime industries side of things. So I guess I'm looking at it from a standpoint of, all right, so where would these container ships or the maritime industry as a whole, where would the vulnerabilities be? I'm thinking pretty much that's just like an engine and all that. Is there a lot of technology that's tied into that other than your transponder type stuff?
Well, yeah. So I think there's a couple of places and that I think there's some pretty obvious things where we have to be careful. And so one of them that's right off the top of my head is actually in navigation. And so a lot of ships will navigate via GPS. And I have to tell you, it is not exactly a difficult science project to jam or spoof GPS in any given part of the world. Especially if you're at high northern latitudes, it's not that accurate kind of anyway. And so, for example, your GPS is something that is vulnerable to those types of attacks. But, what about ships that use different types of voyage management systems? And while that voyage management system might be not connected to the internet currently, it maybe was at one time. And so if we look back and we think about the SolarWinds attack, the SolarWinds was a piece of software that was just vital enough, but also just boring enough to have people kind of not really know what it was. But if you were an expert, you knew that was the vulnerability point. And so there are similar things in our maritime system, whether they're, cargo management or voyage management or different systems that are used, that even if they're not connected to the internet, there could be a piece of software way down the supply chain where somebody found just a small thing that they could alter, and it could cause significant problems. And so I think, when we can think about it in a couple different buckets. So we can think about kind of the actual voyage and the operation of the vessel. So that's both in kind of the navigation and in kind of the diagnostics of the the hardware in the engine room. But then there's also kind of the cargo side of it as well. And then obviously, finally we could talk about communications. And so there's obviously some really serious issues around communications. And I mean, any mariner can tell you that, if you're out alone and unafraid, that is another world to be in, particularly if you're in, a section of the world where things might be a lot less safe. And I think, what we're seeing is there are sections of the world, there are trade routes and, commercial shipping routes that are way less safe than you might have thought, or even a year ago. And so, I think you can't afford to assume that your vulnerabilities are either small or that they're managed, because the convergence of two events, a cyber event and a physical event, that's the thing that you really have to think about and be resilient about, and that's what we used to talk about quite a bit at DHS.
All right, to that point, let me ask this question, because I've heard reports at times where there'll be, we'll say, two container ships that wind up colliding out in the open sea. And it's like, how in the Sam Hill are two big ships? Can they not at least see each other coming at some point? But would that be something that comes into play where if the GPS or your voyage system is been hacked or compromised, that somebody has that been a result of some of these, what do you call it? A shipwreck out on sea?
Well, so I don't know. I don't have necessarily a direct answer to that question. But what I can tell you though is, I was actually in the Navy prior a lifetime ago, so don't hold that against me. But in that role, one of the things that I did was navigation, and so I became very familiar with, whether it was kind of open ocean or pulling into ports, navigating through buoys, different things like that, right? So that was something that I have a lot of previous experience about. And what I can tell you about things like collisions or groundings is that so many things have to go wrong in order without someone stopping it, that it's almost shocking that it ever happens. But it happens. And I think that, if you were to do something like introduce a cyber vulnerability or something like that, you could actually kind of, I would say, almost like shortcut that. So, rather than having, the several gates where, someone could stop and say, wait a minute, we have to stop and look at this, you could almost shortcut that. And so I'll tell you what I would do is if I got access to, let's say, a voyage management system, I wouldn't shut it off. Like if I was the bad guy, I wouldn't shut it off. What I would do is move all of your tracks 500 yards east, but you don't know it. And so you think you're right in the middle of the channel, but you aren't. And you run aground or something like that happens. And so I think those are the things that are pretty scary, because it's obvious when something goes down, right? We know when something's down. But when you think you're okay, but you're not, that's where really scary things can happen.
Amy, from your perspective with the FMC, what is it that you're looking at that you would love to see people? Where is it that maybe our listeners need to help provide some support to some initiatives underway, or actions that need to be taken, if you will, based on all of this to shore up their own, shall we say, their companies and their issues with this?
This is such a great question because it's something that we're asked a lot, and there's a brilliant answer. So in this capacity, I don't represent the FMC. I'm working on this project with the private sector. So one thing that they can do is talk to us, reach out to me, talk to me. What we're doing right now is creating a risk framework for port officials to use, but not just port officials. This supply chain risk. Understand the government has done this in many different capacities. The intelligence community uses it. Right? It's used in the CFIUS process for the uninitiated, has to do with foreign transactions in the United States. The government knows how to manage cyber risk and risks at all times in the supply chain very well. It is this project's goal to create a risk framework that anyone in the private sector can use. The challenge we have is if you've seen one port, you've seen one port. You've heard that so many times, and it's true. But it's even like if you see one stevedore at one port, you've seen one stevedore at one port. The strength of the U.S. economy has so much to do with our economic might, right? And our ability to sort of source things here and export things there. And the fact that we are so decentralized creates many cyber risks, but we also have benefits. If you've seen the Australian attack last year where multiple ports were put offline, right? When you have conglomerate terminals owned and that's when the risk really exponentially increases. So what can people do? Be aware that it's a risk. Just be aware that it's a risk. I think some people within the trade are not aware that they are part of the network, right? It's like, well, this has nothing to do with me. It's like, really? Because if someone clicks on a billing invoice from your HR department and that's malware and you're a broker and you get taken offline and all your cargo stacked everywhere and now it's created, you see like one little thing, it's a network, right? One thing that jams up the whole system. So I think being aware of the risk and knowing that you're part of the risk are step one and step two, right? And we can go into, now or in future podcasts, the things that, because there are resources out there that DHS is trying to provide, but it really comes down to knowing your audience. And that's, I think, where we need the help, right? Because the trade people are over here. I'm not saying the government's siloed. I would never say such a thing. The cybersecurity experts are over here. How do we get these two groups together? How do we talk to these people, right? In a language that they'll understand and understanding the value to someone, to a business owner, to invest this knowledge in their business.
Like in layman terms, I guess, only because honestly, I can be sitting in an airport, which I was when the announcement came out, and people were snickering at how this the executive order was going to target or be scrutinized, I guess, or whatever the term may be, regarding Chinese cranes and equipment. And people were like, how is that even related to cybersecurity? And, how is that going to affect us, et cetera? A lot of us in the industry may know better, but like, how can you explain that to someone? Like, why is that important? Why are they spending all this much money and effort? You know what I'm saying?
Freight shows up at Long Beach, huge, like giant container ship. Crane doesn't work. How do you get that freight? I'm sorry, that's like legitimately the answer. Crane doesn't work. Why does Crane work? Crane procured in a certain country. Crane has software that's controlled by a foreign nation state that wants to do harm to the United States. I'm not saying that that's the case, right? I'm not an official of this executive team to sort of talk to you through that. That is the simplest way to put it. Crane don't work because Crane has been taken offline and we can't get the Crane online. It's sort of like, your worst case Jurassic Park-like scenario. We can't get back online. This crane cannot take cargo off the ship. But I want to kick it to Nick because I think he being outside the government can be more free in sort of his comments here. And I think he can provide a little bit more nuance to it that I think would resonate with viewers.
Thanks, Amy. And one of the things I do on the side is I'm an adjunct professor at New York University. And when I talk to my students there, one of the things I tell them quite frequently is think like you're the bad guy. What would you do if someone said, okay, we have some resources and things like that, and I want you to disrupt the US economy or do something like that? I mean, you could think of like big things, right? But that's actually, when you think of these big things, and that's, like you're not going to sink a cargo freighter or something like that. But what could you do that would be really impactful? If you could do something like shut off all of those giant cranes, or maybe not even all of them, but, a dozen of them in a couple key strategic ports, you could end up with a backlog of cargo that is almost boggles the mind, right? And it slows things down, it shuts things down, prices start to go up. You cause significant problems just by hitting that one thing. And I think that's kind of what Amy is getting at. I mean, if I was someone in that position, I would be looking for what's that critical node that I could press. And there's so many opportunities within that to press that node. And so what gets really interesting now in the port environment, but actually even just in our municipal environments, is that we have so many deployed internet connected sensors that do so many different things. And so, again, talking about the port environment, you might have security cameras, you might have like perimeter sensors. You might have things that do diagnostics on the actual hardware of, a crane or other kind of hardware equipment. Any one of those that for some reason doesn't get the last firmware update has just become your biggest problem. And if we want to get even kind of scarier, any one of those sensors who back 6 months ago when it was first being coded ended up taking in some malicious code and is now calling home and looking for commands, like, you have no idea. You bought it clean off the shelf, you opened the package and you installed it and everything was okay. But the idea that we're now in this place where we can bring internet connected devices to so many different places, just what it does is it makes us now look at our, kind of risk framework or the way that we sort of look at port risk. And you can almost say that some of it is not valid now, because it was not originally planned to have, thousands potentially of internet connected kind of nodes around the port environment. But that is what we're getting to. And I think we can't not do that because of there's a risk of not implementing this technology too. So we really have to look at ways like AEP is doing with the framework under Amy's leadership to allow port owners and operators to say, okay, we're going to do this, but how do we do it effectively? How do we implement the right security controls, governance controls, and things like that? And I think that's where, I think we need to kind of aim not just the port environment, but actually several other environments in our country.
Let me bring up something and just remind everybody that somewhat recently, I guess a few years now at this point, the wireless routers that were installed in government offices, they're installed in U.S. companies around, that were made by Huawei, which is a Chinese company. And nobody thought anything about it initially. But what was discovered, and apparently, if I'm not mistaken, it was the Pentagon's effort that found this, is that there was transmission at an off time of data, and it was like, well, who's working on this? What's going on? And they finally figured out that apparently those Huawei routers were transmitting. They had copied data that was transmitting through there, whether it was email, a text message, a phone call that was using wireless and all that metadata that was all going through that, and it was transmitting it back to China. And all of that was going on. So it was basically espionage in a sense, digital espionage. And it was like, okay, well, wait a minute. And so all those things were obviously eventually pulled down, but it was something that was hard coded into the chips and the circuit boards and all that. So now we come around and now we're on down the road here a little bit, and obviously assessing some of the vulnerabilities, as you were just talking about the cranes, is like, who would have thought, yeah, you've got cameras up there and chips and software that's running these things and trying to collaborate to make things more efficient, but at the same time, giving access to non-port of people, whoever it may be. And in this case, our worry is another government situation. Like you just said, Nick, is that going in is like the vulnerability is they have access to. Who would have ever thought that? It's like, okay, now they're looking at it, and if they want to disrupt something, it could be as simple as you were talking about shutting down a crane, or taking one crane and all of a sudden it malfunctions and drops a container in something, and now it impedes, that particular port. So it's not a case of trying to completely shut something down, but slows the frequency of things and all that. Before I go any further, you mentioned, used a term that some of our folks may not be familiar with, a stevedore. Stevedores are people, by the way, they load and unload the ships. So if that's just a little side note. With that though, so what do we do about all this? Amy, you were talking about, talking, getting more people involved. And if you're interested in this, we're definitely going to have your contact information on our show notes and all that. But when you're talking about, well, that's redundant. When you are asking for people to talk to you, what are you looking at? Just somebody that's interested, or somebody in the industry, or somebody that is with a company that has some influence on some things? What is it you're looking for?
What do we not know? What questions have I not asked you that you think are important? What am I missing? I've been in the trade industry long enough to know that, like, even trade nerds, there's no way to know it all, right? I can't have been a longshoreman, work at a stevedore company, been a broker. There's so many actors that have a role. These are networks. They're networks, right? Who's part of the network that's voice has not been told yet? What story haven't I heard yet, right? I've talked to the port officials. A lot of them don't want to talk to us about cybersecurity. Why? They're businesses, right? Especially if they're a landlord port. They want people to bring their business there. They don't want to talk to us about vulnerabilities, right? It's seen. We need to get past this scarlet letter aspect of cyber threats. We need to just embrace this as, this is just part of the health of an organization. It has nothing to do with how well they do business, right? It's got to be something that people don't feel shameful about, because it reduces and restricts reporting. So I think reducing the stigma and allowing people to come forward and tell me a story I haven't heard yet, which are many and varied, I'm sure. What am I missing? If our project is looking at port framework structures, I want to hear that's not going to work, Amy. That's a terrible idea, Amy Strauss. As you know, Andy Strauss, I'm open to having those conversations. We do this at CBP every day. Every day we have these, because we know that we can't know everything, right? What are we missing? Because I want this product to benefit the conversation, and I want it to forward the conversation, because we already have assets in the field. CISA has assets as a cybersecurity infrastructure agency that are there, and they do work with ports every day. But I talk to these regional directors and they're overwhelmed. People don't want to call them back, right? Like, I need to really raise the advocacy here to get people to understand that, the cyber threats are things that you absolutely should report, and you will get assistance and help from the government, right? DHS is not the FBI. We're not going to seize your servers. CISA will come in and say, okay, let's run some diagnostics. Let's do this. It is free, right? That's the thing that I would love people to understand a little bit better. But from what I need to know what I don't know, because this problem is scoped very large. And my product, I really want to make it narrow focus. Like, how can I help port officials? How can I help people within the network of a port to make sure that their items are as secure as they absolutely can be?
That's a good point, Amy, because some companies are afraid of stepping forward because they're embarrassed. You know what I mean? That they got hacked or something happened, but what you're saying is makes a good point, because you're not going to lose your access to your capital equipment. For example, you at least you'll get help in one way or another, and I mean, it's better to get the help than just keep on being vulnerable in that case.
Yes, and I would agree. And I want Nick's perspective here, because I think it's important that he was in the government and then in the private sector. So many companies, they have insurance, right? You have this cybersecurity insurance, right? And you call in the big guys. They come on in and they say, okay, we're going to help you. You don't need to work with the government. We've got you, right? Here's the thing. The government has information and intelligence that private sector company might not have, right? So by working with the government, right, there's information that regional CISA and regional DHS can provide you on these types of threats, right? So it's like, by creating a partnership, Andy knows this, right? We need to have that simplified entry experience again on this topic, right? Lock folks in a room. What are the vulnerabilities? What do y'all need? What do the businesses need? What's going to be something that's cost effective? The government has this habit, not that I've ever done this, of saying, here's a risk model. And the business owner looks at it and is like, I got to run my payroll. I don't have time for this, right? How can we make this adaptable? So I just want to hear Nick's perspective on that, because I know that he's out now. So it's like, Nick, when you're working with businesses that are like, this is great, Nick, and I'm part of national security, which they are, but how can I make this workable for me? Like, without losing my profit margins, which is like, again, we want to preserve that.
As a COO, I can tell you that running payroll is definitely hard, right? I do it all the time. And, it is definitely, I can understand the pain points there. I truly can. But, I want to return to something that Andy said earlier about espionage. And I just kind of want to say, that absolutely was espionage. 100% that's espionage. And I think there's what happens sometimes is, people say, well, like, gosh, I would never have thought they would have gone after that, or like, well, or this or this. And I think the problem is there's kind of this misnomer or this paradox of aggregated data. So, you might think, well, like, why would somebody want to steal my personal information? Well, if they're not a criminal, you're probably right. Like, they probably don't care. You probably aren't at the level that, you are going to be individually targeted. However, the aggregated data from, like, let's say the neighborhood, where I live, or the city that I live, that aggregated data is incredibly valuable. And what's happening now is we're creating these internet connected, convergence driven regions. And I include ports in that. When I say region, I include ports in that. And so what happens now is, what if you were able to get access to the aggregated collected data from all of those cameras and sensors and everything else across the entire port environment? At this point, you're able to look at all of those efficiencies and things like that you're trying to gain by having the sensors there. And you're able to look at it from another perspective, and you can start to do really bad things really efficiently. And that's actually the kind of thing that scares me is, you're really putting yourself in a position where an actor has a chance to step back, look at everything, and choose the moment for the maximum effect, whether that's physical or cyber. But either way, the lead into that is cyber. And where I want to go with that is, that's the context. And then if more, I guess, business owners, operators understood the context, I think you would have a harder time saying, well, I have to run payroll, so I can't do that, or, something like that, because it really puts your role, you as the owner operator, your role in kind of broader homeland security into really crystal clear focus. And so I would love for us to be able to move away from this idea that, kind of for any company to move one way or another, it has to either be like some really heavy government incentive, or it has to be a really heavy government stick in terms of like a regulation. We need to get to partnership. And that's the effort that Amy's leading. And it's why I was so excited to join it.
That's where I would say, and I agree, Amy, as far as the entry simplification working group that you and I participated in. Again, it was a group of people, and you're trying to do the same thing on your end of it now on the ocean side. And I think it'd be great to go through that. And that was where, again, there were actual importers and exporters. There were service providers. And then I happened to represent carriers at the time. But as we went through, and then of course on the government side and the CBP side, and we started reaching out to other agencies, that same scenario is walking through that. If there was anything, and this is where, I mean, you were talking about me being a bulldog. I was like, everybody would come up with a particular issue. Now, let me tell you something. This is one that was a phenomenal group, and the same thing can happen in other areas here, where you get people together and we focused on issues. And I'm telling you, we had some intense debates, and I'm not talking just a light, well, whatever, and somebody's just a little irritated here and there. We never made it personal, but I'm going to tell you, there was some yelling and gnashing of teeth in those rooms. But we were committed to try and hammer out the issues, whatever it may be, and come up with something. And what we came up with was phenomenal. In the same vein here is walking through it. And my piece of it was, okay, we've come up with, we need this information and this is where it needs to come from. It's like, okay, great. Let's go through the process. And it was painful. And I had to hang in there. It's like, well, wait a minute. Where do you think that information is going to come from? Oh, the carriers will do it. Okay. Where's the carrier going to get it from? And it's going to come from here. And eventually it comes down to the actual customer, if you will, that exporter or importer that's looking at information, the companies that are actually using these service providers. And then it causes a domino effect. You're going to have intermodal scenarios here with the ports and then transferring to rail. You've got those cranes that are going through and the chassis and the different things. What happens if all of a sudden things are out of position? not only do you need to look at a scenario of this, a cyber attack in this particular industry, but then it's not if, it's when, because it's happening. There are things being pushed off. But I would say going through the process and say, okay, when you actually realize it, I think there probably needs to be a little bit more of, all right, what's the fallback? What do we do? How do we pull together as a community in that region, in that port, to fight this off and overcome whatever's been attacked and go from there? Would y'all agree with that?
Oh, Andy, like we didn't plan this, but of course, Andy Schaus and Amy Strauss, we're sharing the same, we're on the same sheet of music. Okay. So as part of our research project, we are planning a tabletop exercise. We want to do it in 2 locations and we want to do it with multiple actors. I don't want to just sit down with like a port landlord who tells me, yep, that's all fine, Amy. I want to hear from every actor. I want a software vendor. I want an importer. I want a broker. You know what I mean? Every piece of, let's put together an entire network, a mini network, and run a tabletop. Oh, invoice comes in that has malware. Let's run through what happens, who does what, who reports to what. By doing, we call them hot washes in the government. I don't know. It's kind of a fun term. It's almost like a real-time hot wash, right? You're like, okay, what does everyone do? If you do not have an exercise like this, people always panic. And you go back to that first impulse, right? And what I've known from previous attacks when I've talked to companies, when I've talked to companies in the past, they go, well, I didn't know anyone from CISA. Well, that's great. In my tabletop exercise, I'm going to invite CISA. All the local CISA people will be there. I'm also going to invite the DH intelligence folks because we have them regionally. I'm going to invite them there. So then you can't say the next time this happens to you, you don't know who to call. You just met that person. Now you know who to call, right? You can go right to the people that we did this exercise with. So we'd like to do it in 2 locations just to see, like, do we have the right flavor? Is the tear sheet right? And then once I structure that, I just say, here's how to do it. You invite these people, you pick this scenario within these criteria, and then Amy Strauss and Nick Reese we can just sell it. Like, here you go, please use it, right? Have CISA endorse it. That's sort of the smart money, right? That's where we're headed. I don't want to just do a drop in the bucket. Oh, thanks for your nothing burger report, Amy. We want to move the needle here. And I think given the skill set we have on this team, we have it. I think we have it. And Andy, you're absolutely right. You have to invite the network of any community you're trying to impact. You have to listen, have tough conversations, and put that feedback into a feedback loop to change up your tabletop. There's too much after this experience, too much we've moved from the simplified entry concept to NPRM. Give us your comments here. That's garbage. That's garbage. That's not working in partnership with anybody. That's just saying, give me your comment. Thank you, Joe importer from Tucson, right? No, that's not what this requires. Something a lot more difficult, which is why I think we've just not been able to get there yet because it's hard, requires executive leadership, which we had a ton of during that project, right? We got Brenda Smith, Cindy Allen. These were the great Cynthia Wittenberg. These women knew it. They had leadership support for it at the highest levels in CBP, which is why it went where it did. So I'm hopeful that this can be the same, right? But I think Nick and I are at a point where we're just done waiting. And we're just DHS has been so awesome and OD&I funds the AAP program. So the IC is there and DHS is right at the table.
With that, let me just say this, because we're going to need to wrap this up, and I know we're going to have some more shows on this. But Nick, let me go to you. Is that based on what we've been talking about here, what would be the key essential actions that you're looking for that you recommend here based on what we've been talking about for somebody to take? And then Amy, I'll go to you to ask the same question.
Well, thanks. And I think there's really two ways I would talk about kind of key actions. And so I think the first one is really about participation and kind of open-mindedness. And at DHS and in the private sector, I hear a lot of people talk about, better information sharing, public-private partnerships, things like that. And that's always true, right? There's never going to be a finish to that. We're never going to be done information sharing. We're always going to be working on improvements to that. But a lot of people that talk about that will say, well, what groups do you participate in? Well, we don't really participate in any groups. Well, yeah, that's probably why information sharing is not great. So, I would say the first thing is just open-minded participation and start to really think about how we can be partners in a way that is not going to be that's not going to reflect negatively on your business. And I would say, as a business owner, I would say there's another level to that, which is, there's actually a reputational risk to you if you do not do these kinds of things. If you have a cyber event and there was, this tabletop exercise and this framework and all these things, and you didn't do that, not only will you be a victim of a cyber attack, but you're also going to be a victim of possible trust issues with the public. So I think there's, a couple of reasons why the partnership aspect is really important. The other side of it is really just kind of practical things that you as a business owner can do that you do not need to hire additional people to do. You can do in-house, even if you're small, which is just get your arms around the cybersecurity things that you have in place today. What do you use a cloud, do you use cloud? What kind of security is around that? Do you use encryption? What kind of security is around that? Do what does it look like to you right now? Because if you can come to one of these events or this, these tabletops or contact CISA or something like that, and you can say, okay, look, we did an internal inventory. We did internal look. Here's what we have. That piece of information, if you can come to the table with that, will make the framework that we produce so much more impactful, and it will be easier for you to execute, because instead of trying to figure out how it fits, we can look at it together and we can say, here are the 5 things you can do right now. Here are the other 5 things that, we can help you with. And then here are 10 things that are long-term. And I think that's manageable even if you are a small business. So I think kind of the participation side and then the kind of self-evaluation inventory side would be my recommendations.
All right. Amy, how about you? What would you suggest some actions you'd like to see from folks here?
I think it's more of an attitude. And I think, you had to have me go after Nick. He's just, how can I follow that? He's amazing. Here's my tip. And this is Amy TED. Now we're TED talking. This is Amy's TED talk. Both you, Lalo, and you, Andy Shiles, have the element of what I call the DC attitude. And the DC attitude goes like this. I'm going to find out who I know in government that's going to be the person that I build my partnership with. If that person is non-responsive, I'm going to call somebody else. If that person is non-responsive, I'm going to call somebody else. I'm going to call somebody else. You follow up. You advocate for yourself. You don't tell to your boss, I called them once and, they never got back to me. If I said that, man, I used to work for Krista Brzezowski. If I told her I followed up and they never called me back, she'd look at me and be like, call them again. You have to advocate, right? And I think that's the skill and the attitude that is needed in this context. If you are reading the news and you see the risk and you're able to advocate within your own company and build and create partnerships within the government, what else is, it sells itself, right? But you have to not have this fear of contact, right? Again, these are agencies, a CISA, again, they don't have the authority to come in and seize anything. That's not what they're there for. They're there to support and to provide, right? Understand the mission, inform yourself. So much of it's on the web, folks. Read it. It's there. It's there for you, and be open to having the conversation and sometimes very difficult conversations. And as Andy said, don't take it personally. Just we're just working together.
Well, to that point, I will say that in looking at folks, we're going to have both Amy and Nick's contact information with their show notes. If you've got questions on some of this, feel free to reach out to them. And definitely, I guarantee you, they can probably point you in the right direction. You were talking about that DC attitude. That's what I call bird dogging. You just keep going after something. And if they're not going to help you, then you keep going after and get somebody that can get you closer to your end result. But get involved. Here's the other thing about participation when we're talking about it. If there are changes coming up regarding anything in the maritime, if you will, in this case, in the ports and whatnot, as far as the way things are going, would you rather the government just come up with their procedures and policies and all of that without any input? Or would you rather have some input into that and guide it along? To me, I would rather have participation and guide it along, and it is a joint effort, and it goes on from there. Because just because somebody's in the government doesn't mean they are necessarily an expert in the area. You are an expert. You need to provide your input so you can provide some adequate influence. So all said and done, we're going to have, again, the contact information there. don't sit on your backside and just sit and listen to this and go, this is interesting. You need to get involved, especially if you're involved, whether directly using the ocean transportation mode, or if you are a carrier or a service provider or whatever. All that to say, folks, we greatly appreciate it, and thank you for our shows that you've been liking and sharing and continue to do so. We are hitting new milestones with our show, and we need to continue doing that. Also, reach out to our guests as well as ourselves on LinkedIn. And, again, if you got some feedback on that, if you want to part my hair with a hatchet on something I've brought up, then feel free to come on. So let's talk about it. All that to say, folks, thank you so much.
Thank you very much for joining us. Simply Trade is brought to you by the generous contributions of Global Training Center. You can follow the show and GTC on LinkedIn or Twitter and other social networks. Make sure you check out the show notes in the description for a full rundown of today's show with all the important links. Also, make sure that you share this with a friend and subscribe on your favorite streaming platform. We really like hearing from you. If you enjoyed the show, make sure to rate and review wherever you listen to this podcast. If you or someone you know would like to be a guest in the show or would like to sponsor Simply Trade or suggest any topic you would like for us to discuss, please contact us via email at simplytrade@globaltrainingcenter.com, or you can DM us on Twitter at simplytradepod. Thank you again for the privilege of your time. Happy trading. Simply Trade is not a law firm or an advisor. The topics and discussions conducted by Simply Trade hosts and guests should not be considered and is not intended to substitute legal advice. You should seek appropriate counsel for your own situations. These conversations and information are directed towards listeners in the United States for informational, educational, and entertainment purposes only and should not be substituted for legal advice. No listener or viewer of this podcast should act or refrain from acting on the basis of information on this podcast without first seeking legal advice from counsel. Information on this podcast may not be up to date depending on the time of publishing and the time of viewership. The content of this posting is provided as is. No representations are made that the content is error-free. The views expressed in or through this podcast are those of the individual speakers, not those of their respective employers or Global Training Center as a whole. All liability with respect to actions taken or not taken based on the contents of this podcast are hereby expressly disclaimed.